Welcome, everyone. We are so excited about this All Books Considered Book Club event tonight. I'm Cindy Hahn, and I'm very, very thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with author Christina Baker Kline about her amazing book, The Exiles. Christina is a New York Times bestselling author. She's written 8 novels, including The Orphan Train, Piece of the World. She has won the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, among many other prizes. And she lives here in Maine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's such a treat to have you here, Christina.
I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here. Thank you, Cindy. It's wonderful.
Sure. And also a big thank you to our 2 sponsors, Birchbrook and Bull Moose, and to our book partners who helped many of you secure your copy of The Exiles. Many of you sent questions in advance. Thank you for that. And feel free to use the comments feature on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll try to address as many of your questions as possible. So let's get started. Christina, congratulations on this great book and the best-selling already in paperback already. So all kinds of exciting things happening. So many questions for you already. So I'm just going to kick right off with, actually, I'm going to hold off on asking about the book because I first want to ask you about how you've been working during the pandemic and how that's been for you.
You know, I think I'm fortunate, at least for my own personality, in that I am immersed in research for a new novel, and I've also been working hard on doing events for The Exiles, which came out in hardcover last August and just came out a few weeks ago in paperback. So there's been a lot of stuff to do for that. Some of my friends have written multiple novels during this pandemic, and I myself found that I was a little too restless. I couldn't quite focus enough to do new writing. I did write a few essays, but I think that it was perfect to be able to immerse myself in research. My new novel that I'm working on now, I'll talk about it later, but it takes place in Civil War era North Carolina. So there's a lot to learn. And that's been a sort of fun research project.
And you also started a newsletter, didn't you? So how did that come about?
I did.
How can people read it?
So people can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website. And as it turns out, it's kind of fun, but it felt like such a just the whole sales aspect of all of it, I have trouble with. And so I was worried that I would be doing a newsletter that nobody needed or wanted. And it was just asking people to buy my book. And I ended up actually having a really good time because I'm a little bossy by nature, and I was able to recommend books and even my favorite shoes in the summer in Maine, for example, and things like that. I talk about recipes I really like. I talk about, for example, Fiore olive oil, which I gave to my co-presenters as gifts all over the country, this wonderful Maine women-owned business, and another female-owned business in Maine called Mumbai to Maine, which I adore. So it's been a way for me to kind of talk about things I love. And anyway, so it wasn't so gruesome as I had feared. It wasn't as gruesome as I had feared.
That's really fun. You're going to become a lifestyle brand before you know it.
It's horrible. No, that's a whole different horrible thing.
Well, another
having a good time.
Yeah, that's great that you can tuck all of that in there. That's really fun. Another exciting development, I hear that the Exiles is going to be made into a television show.
Yeah, I mean, that thing is actually super exciting. My 3 recent novels, well, many of my novels have been optioned, and Cindy, as you know, being in the business, often nothing comes of it. But my 3 latest novels have all been optioned and are all in various stages of something or other happening. But it feels like The Exiles could happen first. It's a team of women who they did Gone Girl and Wild and Big Little Lies, and they just did The Undoing. They're wonderful. They did The Dry, a movie that came out recently. They're based in LA and Sydney, and I'm executive producing, and so I'm quite involved. And it feels that things are moving ahead pretty quickly. They don't tend to buy things that they don't make, so I'm excited about it. I think it will happen, and we'll talk about this later too, but one of the joys of talking about this possible series is that some of the storylines that I wasn't able to pursue all the way through, secondary characters and things like that, we can actually address in this series. So for example, the character of Olive, who a lot of readers like because she's very bawdy and funny and she's sort of a truth teller, she'll probably have an episode of her own, that kind of thing. So yeah.
Oh gosh, how fun to think about who could play those different characters too.
It's true.
And speaking of where you've been during the pandemic, you were saying, are you in Maine all the time now? You're a bona fide Mainer.
Yeah, I grew up in Bangor, and then eventually my whole family migrated to the coast. My parents retired to a little harbor town, Bass Harbor, Maine, right on Mount Desert Island. And my sisters and I have 3 sisters. We all bought houses within 2 miles eventually over the years. And on March 13th of 2020, my children, I think on the 12th, they came to dinner in New York City. We all live in New York. We all lived in New York. And they said, we have to go to Maine, like tomorrow. And my husband and I were a little skeptical, but it became clear over 12 hours or so. It was this tipping point, as you may remember from last March. And we came up thinking we would be here for a few weeks. I think I literally threw things into garbage bags and came up. And we never left. We've been here ever since. So we will go back into the city in September, but we've been here for 18 months and just had the most marvelous, terrifying, stressful, all the things that COVID is, but we're on the coast on an island where it has very little, Hancock County, not many cases. And so we feel very lucky to have been here. And the other thing, Cindy, is that it's sort of, I think for a lot of people, this period has sort of taught you what you value and where you want to be. And we've just realized how much we want to be here in Maine. So I think we're going to be refiguring out our lives so that we can spend much more time here.
That's great. It is quite a haven here. So it's nice to know that you're here.
Yeah.
Let's get to the book. So much to talk about, but one of the things is that I think the first thing I feel like this is a book that sweeps you away. You get completely engrossed in it, and you must have just done so much research. That's all I kept thinking as I was reading it is, how did she research this book? So maybe tell us a little bit about the catalyst to how you picked this topic and then how you went about writing it.
Sure. Well, first, let me start by saying I know not everyone has read the book. So I'll quickly just say in one sentence that The Exiles is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia in the early to mid 19th century, and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when British colonists landed on their shores. And when I say transformed, these women were swept off the streets of Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and they were sent to what was called the land beyond the seas, which is Australia, and into prisons. But eventually, if they got out, they had a chance at social mobility that they never would have had in England. So that's sort of an amazing part of my story, and that part happens toward the end. There's a lot they go through a lot, the women who were transported. But wait, I'm coming back to your question. Let me think. What was it again?
Well, what made you decide this was a story you're going to tell? And then how did you research all of it?
Yeah. Well, so, okay, about a decade ago, this is how things happen, I think, when you write. And when you write novels in particular, at least in my experience, I stumbled on an article in the New York Times that was a parenting column that I read because I had 3 boys who were sort of early teenagers. And it was by Lisa Belkin, this New York Times editor, who was wonderful. It was called Motherload, which I don't think it would be called today. But it was about the convict women, and it was an unusual column. She wrote about the history of the convicts and women and children sent on these often repurposed slaving ships. And I just had this full body tingle. And I knew that this should be my next book. And I did a bunch of stuff in the meantime, and I sort of began to look into it. But I only realized when I finished the book that actually important reasons from my own life that I was drawn to this topic. I mean, lots of other people read that New York Times article and did not have the same feeling that I had. So I realize now that I had been a Rotary Fellow in my 20s, and that was sort of a formative experience. I had taught in 2 women's prisons that was mind-blowing and life-changing in some ways for me. And I also wrote a book with my mother where we interviewed 60 women, mothers and daughters. It was about feminism and how and if feminism is passed from one generation to the next. And that book really taught me, I think, the value of women telling their stories, and stories that have often been left out of the history books. So I think those 3 things, writing about women, writing about the criminal justice system in some way, and my Australian experience, all kind of came together in that passion for this subject.
Have you always gotten that tingle when you know it's a book that you're going to write?
You know, I've learned, I have 8 novels and 5 nonfiction books, and I've learned as my life and my career has moved forward that that's the voice, that's the feeling. It's often a terror that I need to run toward and not run away from. I think in my early novels, I shied away from things that were that felt too immense, big subjects, or subjects that I felt I didn't have a right to tell. And when I stumbled on the story of the Orphan Trains, Orphan Train was a novel I did, 7 or 8 years ago. And it's the novel that sort of changed my career because I had always written contemporary novels. And my husband's grandfather, we stumbled on this information that he had been featured in this article on orphan train riders. And he had died a number of years earlier and no one knew, even his children. His daughter didn't know, his daughters didn't know, no one knew. And so I was terrified of the topic. I didn't think I had a right to it. I'm not Midwestern. I might be married to one, but I'm not one myself. And so I wasn't sure what right I had to tell it, and also if I could pull off writing about the past. And I, with a great deal of terror and a lot of research, I tackled that story, which now that I look back at it, I can see that I only had 100 pages of that book set in the past. The other 200 and something were set in the present. So it wasn't, I kind of eased into it. But then I took on a really big subject, which was writing about Andrew Wyeth and the subject of his best known painting. And those people lived and, were real people, not made up people. And so that was another whole kind of challenge. And from there, I just decided, you know what, I'm going to only write books that terrify me and that are fascinating to me and thrilling and have something in them that draws me that I may not understand right away. And so that's sort of what I'm doing.
That's fantastic. And actually, I know that you have a video that gives some of that historic context and the sites and characters that you incorporated into the book. So we're going to take a look at this video. It's about 3 minutes long, and then we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Can I say one thing about it before we start?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, so for these books that are set in the past, some of you in the audience may have seen them. I do slideshow presentations that are about the sort of genesis of the book, how it came together, the research I did, and they're often about 30 minutes long. So I did one for the Exiles. It took me a month, and then it became clear that I would never give it. So when the paperback was coming out, we decided to take my material, all the slides I've gathered, all the permission I got for photographs, all this stuff, and my script, some of my script, and we boiled it down to 2 minutes. And then the final minute is some more slides that I had found. And also my 3 sons are singing a sea shanty that is an Australian sea shanty that was very common on the ships.
I love that. People are going to enjoy that. So let's take a look.
Okay. I'm interested in the stories of people who've historically been on the margins of society, whose experiences have been ignored or overlooked. Several years ago, when I read an article about British women who committed crimes of poverty and were exiled to Australia by the government, I knew I'd found the subject of my next novel. Diving into the research, I learned that an island called Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, was the primary British penal colony in Australia.
About 40% of all convicts were sent there. You can see it in the bottom right-hand corner of this map. By the early 1800s, male convicts outnumbered females in Australia 9-1. The British government had a problem. They wanted to establish a thriving outpost, not just a prison settlement. So they began targeting women for transportation. The vast majority had committed petty crimes like stealing bread. Most had no prior convictions. Over the course of 50 years, more than 25,000 women in England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were exiled to the land beyond the seas, as British courts referred to Australia. Very few ever returned to their homelands. In the Exiles, as in real life, the convict women sentenced to transportation first spent months in London's notorious Newgate prison. After a 4 to 6 month ocean voyage, those sent to Van Diemen's Land arrived in the capital town of Hobart. They were marched 4 miles to the edge of town to a prison workhouse called the Cascades Female Factory. This is also where the convict women in my novel end up. The crossing from England to Australia wasn't easy, and conditions in the female factories could be grim. But if the convicts were able to survive both, they had a rare opportunity to forge a new life in a land almost free of the rigid class strictures they had known. Of course, for the Indigenous people who were forced to abandon their land, their culture, and their families when the British colonized Australia, it was a different story, one that I felt was important to include in the book. In The Exiles, writing about people, real and imagined, whose stories are not well known, I wanted to make these long-ago lives feel vibrant and relevant. It's an honor to share this piece of history.
Farewell to old England forever. Farewell to my rom-coms as well. Farewell to the well-known Old Bailey, where I used for to cut such a swell. Singing to rally, adity. Singing to rally, singing to rally, adity. And we're bound for Botany Bay. There's the captain as is our commander. There's the bosun and all the ship's crew. There's the first and the second class passengers. Knows what we poor convicts go through. Singing to rally, adity. Singing to rally, singing to rally, adity. And we're bound for Botany Bay. And we're bound for Botany Bay.
That was great. And tell us about your sons. Are they singers?
Yeah, they are kind of singers. There was music all the way through that for some reason wasn't in it, but that's fine. Yeah, they are. I mean, gosh, I think I've made it. I think that the idea of being an artist, unfortunately, isn't so foreign to them. So, you know, they're pursuing music in different ways. But yeah, so it was fun. They sang that shanty that, by the way, the convict men on those sailing ships often sang. There's one that the women sing about being a convict maid that I have in the novel that was really interesting. I mean, there's so much about Australian culture that is taken from their convict past. And, you know, there was a whole movement to have that song be the Australian national anthem, actually.
Wow.
I know. And, you know, today, Australians are proud of their heritage. 20% of Australians are descended from convicts. But for a long time, people felt this real shame about it, the way the orphan train riders felt. They called it the convict stain, and they wouldn't talk about it for generations. So that was interesting to understand.
So every little detail, like what you just mentioned, the song, and then what we saw in the video, I'm still perplexed. How is it that, I mean, how long did it take you to sort of dig into that much of the historical record in order to, it seemed like every sentence you wrote had to have details in it, and those details had to come from somewhere. So how did you pull that off?
I mean, it's such a balancing act. I love to research. My father is a historian, and I learned from him kind of how to do that. I enjoy it so much that it's sometimes hard to start to stop researching and start writing, because of course you're learning stories about the way the world worked and you're seeing all these parallels. I mean, one of the things about writing The Exiles and publishing it into this period is that it was a time of great social unrest. What was happening to the Aboriginal people at the time, when BLM started happening and George Floyd, and then that social movement moved across the globe. There was so much that was reverberated for me in my research, and the roots of racism all over the world, but in particular British colonialism that manifested in different ways in our country, America, and of course in Australia. And then the story of the convict women and the Me Too movement, all of that felt, again, that the roots of how women were treated, they were sent to Australia as breeders because Australia was 9-to-1 men to women. And they did populate this new land. And it's this crazy idea. It's a crazy idea. And
it worked so amazingly, right?
It worked strangely and interestingly. But yes, I did a ton of research, but it was such a joy to do. And I went to Australia several times. I met this incredible world expert, several, but one in particular, Alison Alexander, who's written 35 books. She's a professor in Tasmania and about the convict women. She herself is descended from convicts, and she wrote about Lady Jane and Sir John Franklin, who are historical figures in real IRL. They really lived. But she's the one who introduced me to the story of Mathena, who's the girl in my book, who's actually a real person. And then she also introduced me to to this incredible, again, world expert, Dr. Gregory Lehman, who consults with museums and films, and he's a professor, and he's descended from a Tasmanian Aboriginal tribe. And so he was an early reader for the book as well, and also sort of kept me on track with some things that I didn't know. And, when you go into a project like this, you don't know anything. So I had to start from nothing.
Right. And you used in the beginning of each chapter, those little quotations that you used, those were real historic. Those were all real. And I wanted to include them to show that none of this is made up. This really happened. I have characters who I've populated my world with here. But there are also people who lived, like Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker reformer, was a real person. And some of her quotes in the book, I was just looking back because someone wanted me to read something the other day, and I realized, those are real things that she said. And the sermons from some of the ministers are real sermons, so the attitudes that I describe in the novel, some of which can seem shocking, are documented in these kind of epigraphs that I have scattered throughout the book. Do you call them an epigraph? Do you call it an epigraph if it comes clear much? But these interstitial kind of bits throughout the novel. Well, so many questions from our readers about the characters, and I have some too. But before we do that, maybe you can kick us off with a little reading. I think, were you going to read about Evangeline first?
I'll read a 1 minute. I know that it's
That'd be great. I mean, she's the one that we first fall in love with and identify with. So from there, we move to the characters. But go ahead.
For people who haven't read the book, Evangeline is a governess who has its precipitous fall into this world of Newgate Prison and then eventually onto the convict ships. She's accused of a crime that she doesn't do, although she's implicated in different ways. But she has always lived a sort of middle-class life. Her father was a vicar, and she's a reader, and she has never really experienced the rough side of things. And so here she is for the first time getting a taste of that. So now, sitting in the drafty carriage, Evangeline moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials intertwined with the family crest, a lion, serpent, and crown. Cecil is the reason that she's here, by the way. It was all she would ever have of him, except apparently for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable next to her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. Evangeline felt a prickle of shock. She had never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way, the butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. Slowly, it dawned on her. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible.
So, Christina, this passage, it hints at this feeling that you get throughout the book that you're just like, oh, darn, just things get from bad to worse for.
Yeah, I mean, you know that she's headed into Hades, basically. And as she descends down the steps into Newgate Prison, you realize, you're going with her on this journey. And I wanted Evangeline to be your way into the story because she's sort of a stand-in for the reader. She's a reader. She's literate. She can't imagine herself in prison, like most of us probably. Whereas the rest of my convict characters are pretty seasoned. They've been around the block. They know that world. They know what they're getting into, and they're not surprised by any of it. And Evangeline is surprised by all of it. So I liked having her as a sort of way into the story.
That brings me to a question we have. There were, like I said, a lot of questions about the characters. And so this is an email from Michelle, and she says, I do not believe that I have read a novel before where the main character is killed off halfway through the book.
I don't know if you want to give it away.
Would like to hear from the author about her decision making around this unusual step.
I don't usually talk about that because if people haven't read the book, it's a whole thing. But I will say, why don't I say this? I wanted to create a world in which it's clear to the reader that anything can happen at any time. And as I read contemporaneous accounts of the convict women and of what they went through, I learned that nothing mattered about who they were in a different life. They were on these ships. They were at the mercy of a system that they didn't quite understand. Their lives had little value to other people. They were taken from everything they knew, everyone they'd ever met, and shoveled into the base of a ship, the orlop deck, with strangers who didn't know them or care about them. And they had no protection, and they were at the mercy of everything. So I wanted the reader to understand what that felt like. And I didn't want, sometimes when you read novels, the main character becomes very precious, and the main characters, I should say, and you sort of know, you can see the arc building and how it's going to play out, and that there's a romance toward the end or whatever, especially historical novels. There are a lot of historical novels I feel that are, first of all, way overstuffed with showing off research. And second, that there's a kind of obvious trajectory. And nothing was obvious or clear in this world. And I wanted to jolt the reader into realizing that anything could happen. So that was always my intent. I knew from the beginning that I was going to do that. And furthermore, the novel is a sort of hero's journey. I actually mapped it on Joseph Campbell's 12 Steps, but through various characters. And so you start with this one character, and you move on to someone who's the perfect guide, I think. I imagined it as a relay race, that one character hands the baton to the next. And that baton is both literal and metaphorical, in that there are actual things that are handed on: a child, a necklace, a handkerchief, books. And then there are all these metaphorical things: the gift of literacy, an understanding of the play The Tempest, which sort of plays a big role in the book, an understanding, a whole bunch of things like that. Relationships are passed on. And and then it goes to the next person, and then it goes to the third person. There's a gap of 26 years for the end of the novel. And I loved that idea of this story being woven through different characters.
That makes me want to ask you how much you plan ahead. Is any of this just evolve as you're writing, or do you just have it mapped out all the way through to the end of what happens?
I don't have it mapped out. And in fact, usually my novels end in a slightly ambiguous way, and people say, but I want to know what really happened. And I say, well, all the roots of it are there in the story. Like in Orphan Train, for example, it ends this pivotal scene where they're all standing on the porch and someone comes around the corner, and I know that I have seeded sort of what's going to happen sort of in the book. But what was so satisfying about The Exiles is that I actually wrote a real ending. I wrote a 20-something page coda to the book, which is 26 years later. You go back to where the book started and you actually understand a whole lot more about the situation. And you also see what happens next and how generationally things changed for convict women. And so that was really exciting. I didn't always know that I was going to write the ending. I could have ended the book on the slightly ambiguous end that I created before that. But I had this burst of enthusiasm to actually kind of nail the landing. And so that was very exciting to do. And I had not planned to do that at all. There were certain things that in order to write a novel like this, you sort of have some long arcs that you think about in advance. But there were plenty of things that surprised me. And I mentioned the character of Olive, for example. She was a very minor character who grew and grew in scope as the book developed. She just became the character who, it was a great way for me to get some exposition out. In other words, she was able to tell Evangeline and Hazel what was really going on, because she knew sort of behind the scenes from having been in this situation for so many years. She knew what the British government was doing, and she was able to say it in this sort of offhanded, irreverent way, so that I, as the writer, didn't have to write these plotting paragraphs about what was sort of happening to these convict women. And so I loved her as a character, and I was able to really use her and take advantage of her. And I kind of wish I had done more with her, even, because I grew to love her.
She felt really contemporary. It felt like someone you could just picture. Did you have a favorite character?
I would say my favorite character is Hazel. I've discovered in my old age that writing characters with agency who are not depressed and are sort of forward looking is a lot easier than writing depressed characters. I wrote one novel with a car crash at the beginning and a child dies. And I remember at one point writing that book that I would just thought, what am I doing? I'm having to write my way out of this depression for 100 pages here. And Hazel, although she has this sort of low moment, she's actually really scrappy, and she's also really talented, and she has a skill that she can barter. And so writing her, she was a very active character. She was a problem solver. She was thoughtful, and she was complicated. And so I would say she was probably, my favorite character overall. But when you said Olive is a contemporary character, I was reminded of this great quote from Hilary Mantel. She said, I write contemporary novels that are set in the past. And I love that idea. That's what I aspire to do as well.
When you just mentioned Hazel's skills and her strength and her ability to move forward, I think about all the great details about the actual healing arts that you worked into there, and about all the potions and tinctures and her knowledge of all of that. And that in itself was sort of its own theme or storyline, is that healing element. That again, I'm assuming took a lot of research, but is that something you already knew much about or were interested in working into a story somewhere?
Well, it's a combination. I had this amazing experience. I've never told Tess Gerritsen this, but she sort of changed my life. Tess Gerritsen, I'm sure you all know, is a very famous Maine writer who writes thrillers. And long ago in Camden, Maine, we were at this, used to have a literary festival. She was the keynote. I was there with two kids I used to babysit, Stephen King's sons, Joe and Owen, who are wonderful. And so we got to hang out for a weekend, and Tess gave this 45-minute talk at the end of the conference. And it was about this book she did called The Boneyard. And in it, she wrote about doctors in the early 19th century and how they would refuse to believe midwives. And their patients would die of what they called childbed fever, puerperal fever, which meant that these doctors had dirty hands. They didn't wash their hands, and the women died in agony. And it was very common. And midwives knew long before doctors did what the truth was, what was really going on. And the doctors refused to believe them. And so Tess gave this incredible keynote. And first of all, it was the first time that I thought, wow, I want to do research like that. That is fascinating. That story is amazing. And she has so much to talk about and so much to think about. And second, it ignited an interest in midwifery in me. And I don't know if you've read Chris Bojalian's Midwives, but he's a fantastic writer on this subject also. And then I grew up in a hippie household. My parents grew all this stuff in our Bangor garden. There were all these herbs that we were constantly taking. And my mother kind of believed in all that stuff. She believed in astrology, although actually my sister said something the other day that I thought was so interesting, that at one point she asked my mother, do you really believe in astrology? And my mother said, well, I'm not sure I believe in it, but I use it. Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, that is so scary that she said that. I don't even know what that means. But I kind of feel that way about this healing arts stuff. I mean, I believe that a lot of the stuff the midwives did was actually way better than the doctors, and the doctors were so arrogant they didn't listen. But there are also some things that, who knows, healing with herbs. If I went through cancer treatment and I was treated traditionally, and I'm glad I was. But, I love all that stuff. And it was such a fun rabbit hole to go down to do a lot of research about it.
Yeah, I loved reading that part. I have to get to another character before we go too far. Mathena, you mentioned briefly at the beginning that she was based on a real character. So can you tell us a little about the historic part of that, and then also her role in the story?
Yeah. So I told you I stumble on this article in the New York Times. I get a tingle. I start researching the convict women. I decided this was going to be my book. I was all set. And then I went to Tasmania. I went to Australia. And I also, as I said, I met Dr. Alison Alexander, and I spent a lot of time with her there as well. And it became clear reading her books, and also then reading many other books, that Mathena was this she was a real person. She was the daughter of a chieftain, essentially by the British considered a princess, who had been orphaned. And she was taken in by the governor of Hobart, Sir John Franklin, and his wife, Lady Jane, as a social experiment. They wanted to see if they could turn her into a British-style lady. And so they dressed her in silks, and they taught her French, and they had her learn the cotillion and manners and use forks and knives and all of this. And then they went back to London and they abandoned her. And from then on, she was caught between two worlds. She had lost, this was only 4 years later, she had lost her language. She wasn't there weren't many Aboriginal people left because the British put them in these open air concentration camps, basically. And eventually all full-blooded Aboriginal people in Tasmania died by the late 1860s. But Mathena was caught between cultures, and the white people didn't know what to do with her, and her own people didn't either. And so it was a really tragic story. And in real life, at the age of 17, she was found drowned in a stream. They don't know if it was murder or suicide, or if it was a sort of maybe drunken accident she had taken to drink. And but Mathena has become sort of a symbol, as I said, for what happened to the Aboriginal people as a whole. And her story was at exactly the same time that my story took place in the 1840s. And I realized that it would be irresponsible not to address this, even though, again, the terror I spoke of earlier, I was terrified of telling a story that I didn't have a right to tell, of being accused of appropriating a story. So I was careful. I wrote the book in the third person for a reason. And I also, Mathena was a child, not an adult consciousness. So I was writing from the perspective of a 5 to 8-year-old, really, to 12. Eventually, sorry, an 8 to 12-year-old. I changed her age for the book. And then I had a lot of people read it and sort of make sure that I got it right. But I wanted to show that very important part of the story. And so again, it was one of those choices that is hard, scary and hard, but I'm glad that I included her. I'm still not sure. I mean, I still wake up at night and think, did I handle that story right? I didn't want, my book ends after 4 years. So she drowned a few years later. But I didn't address that. There was so much heartache in the book. I didn't want to go that far with it, but I left her. My goal was, and I did leave her with a moment of connection with Hazel, but it was a tough story. Yeah.
That was another segment that you thought you might read to us, right? Where she is connecting with Hazel. Let's hear that. And then I do have another question that's related to that from one of our listeners. But I thought that was very gratifying that she did at least forge that bond with Hazel.
Yeah, and that felt very real to me when I was in Tasmania touring a manor house that was essentially like the governor's mansion, which is where Mathena lived. I learned that there were always convict maids working there. And so it was very natural that Hazel would end up working in the governor's house and have access to everything and to meet Mathena, who was neglected. She was
right.
She was well fed and she was dressed in clean, given baths, and there were plenty of staff around to help her, but she was really not treated like a child. And so I wanted to show that. Anyway, so this is the moment that she's about to leave. And it's when the Franklins are going back to England and she's being left on her own. So, and again, it's about a minute, I hope. Mathena looked down at her brown hand and Hazel's pale, freckled one. They were almost the same size. My friend, the one who died, taught me a trick to play in your mind when you're troubled, Hazel said. You think of yourself as a tree with all the rings inside, and every ring is someone you care about or a place you've been. You carry them with you wherever you go. Mathena remembered what her mother had said about thinking of yourself as the thread of a necklace, the people and places you treasure as the shells. Maybe Wanganip, her mother, and Hazel were saying the same thing, that if you love something, it stays with you, even after it's gone. Her mother, her father, Pale, the spiny mountain ridge and the white sand beach on Flinders, Waluka, her pet possum, the sister she never knew, Hazel even, each a separate shell, all embedded in the rings. Maybe she would always be alone and apart, always in transition on the way to somewhere else, never quite belonging. She knew both too much and too little of the world. But what she knew she carried in her bones, her mother's love, the shelter of her stepfather's arms, the warmth of a campfire, the silky feel of wallaby grass against her shins. She'd seen a strip of land from the open ocean and learned to rig a sail, felt the shapes of different languages in her mouth and worn a dress of scarlet satin, posed for a portrait like the daughter of a chieftain she was. She felt her fear unspooling like a tight fist opening. It was as if she'd been standing on a precipice and suddenly tipped forward. There was no point in feeling afraid. She was already falling through the air, and her future, whatever it held, was rushing up to meet her.
It's beautiful, and it encapsulates a lot of the themes of the book just right there.
It does. That little part has some of the stuff that all of them were wrestling with about belonging and finding what you can hang on to when you have nothing, and how you carve meaning out of very bleak circumstances.
Right. And it also mentions Waluka, which is a little detail that I want to ask you too. How were you able to write about what it's like to have a pet possum?
Well, I did learn that Australian possums are very different from American possums. American possums are a little terrifying and very rat-like, and Australian possums are incredibly adorable, and people do have them as pets quite often. And so I went to a wildlife sanctuary and I held an Australian possum. I have a little rubber one that I brought home with me that sits on my desk, and also Waluka was real, and what happened to that possum was everything about that was real. The details of the that Mathena had come from this island, Flinders, with a rush basket filled with a kangaroo skin and her possum, and these green shell necklaces that her mother made. All of those were details that were true.
Oh, wow. That's really good to know. I just kept thinking, did you actually hold a possum? And you did.
I did. And Montague was real, who had a sort of competition with Sir John Franklin. The two of them had this very contentious relationship, and he brought this terrible dog to the governor's house. And that was true.
Wow. That's amazing. There's a question here, an email from Jude, who says, I found The Exiles to be a compelling and deeply researched story. Can you talk about how you chose to end Mathena's part in the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did just talk about that, but as you now know, and if you go to Wikipedia or even just to my website, I have a whole section devoted to Mathena. She died in these tragic circumstances not long thereafter. And there had been so much in the book that was, I think, tough. And I wanted to end her story on as I said, on a moment of connection. I later wondered if I should have had Mathena show up again, but she just was sort of in a spiral in real life. And I wanted to be true to the real story. This is a question when you're writing fiction that's set in the past, or when you're writing fiction at all that has real characters. How much fidelity should you have, or do you have, and why? What does it matter? I have a friend who writes historical fiction who says, I mean, if you want to read history, go read nonfiction. This is not history. Don't read my book for the facts. Read my book for other things. And I want people to read my books for character and for language and all of that. But gosh, with a story like Orphan Train, the Christina Olsen story, and this one, I felt the same way, which was many people are coming to this story for the first time, and I want to be as factually accurate as I can and still have the freedom as a writer to tell the story the way I want to. It's a balancing act. I used to write poetry. I studied poetry in college more than fiction writing. And I studied with formal poets like John Hollander and Anthony Hecht. And I wrote sestinas and many complicated poetry forms that taught me that sometimes within structure, you can be more creative. And I find that about writing about real people and writing about the past, that there's a way in which my creativity is unleashed because I have these firm guidelines about what I can do. And so with Mathena's story, as I say, I wanted to stick to the facts as much as I could. And that created its own set of rules for me in the book.
That's so interesting. We have an email from Kendra who says, I loved Ruby, and the women were just so strong in this book. And that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you about the strong female bonds throughout the book. That's very integral to your story. Is there anyone in your life who you base that on? Any strong female relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this book. First of all, I have 3 sisters, and we're all really close. So yes, absolutely. I think that a lot of what I've never really written about sisters, but in my novels, if you look at them, there are often connections between women that are forged in difficulty. And I would say, my sisters and I didn't have necessarily the easiest childhood in some ways. My mother was really complicated. She was wonderful and complicated. But we developed our own sort of language and way of communicating. And I think that was very important to me growing up, and still is. But there's that. And then, as I mentioned, I did a book with my mother. We both survived, and it was actually a really wonderful experience. I'm so glad I did that, because I don't know if I can't even believe it happened. But we interviewed all these mothers and daughters, and I just listened to lots and lots of stories of connection and disconnection and reunion. And it was really interesting. And I think I have taken that cache of information with me through my whole career of writing novels. I mean, endless stories about women in relationship to each other.
Great. And we have an email from Walter joining from Newport, and he says, I have written about 40% of my second historical novel. Christina is inspiring me to get back to creating.
Good. That's great. Well, that's not a question, but I'm very happy to hear it. I mean, listen, I think writing is really hard. And I love having written, but I write longhand, which is also laborious. Why in the world do I do that? But what I find is that it really, Walter, is just a matter of getting yourself to put the words on the page with the trust and belief that you can come back and fix them. That's the only thing that enables me not to just hover above the page, is the knowledge that I can come fix it. And I do. There are many, many drafts before a book is done. But that first draft is so hard. And especially with the kind of research that I've been doing lately, to be able to sift through that and not have it overloaded with unnecessary detail takes a lot of time and work, and it's daunting. So it is just jumping in and doing it.
Well, I've read that you say that with writing, you have to be willing to tear things up and start all over again. Is that something you did anywhere in this book, or you can give an example of doing that?
I don't mean that literally, in that I have never thrown away an entire manuscript.
Okay, good.
So I have friends who write really quickly and write manuscripts and toss them out and write another one. I haven't done that, but I do work my prose so hard, and then it doesn't always resemble anything like the original draft. And what I've learned is, over the years, is I used to write slowly and carefully, and I didn't edit quite as much. And now I write faster. And I think that writing more quickly and then pivoting, and sometimes I'll write the same scene from a different perspective and just plow through and not look back. I mean, I look over the next morning, I often look over the day before, but I'm not trying to cut too much at that point. And it's not until I come back to the second draft, which for me is typing, which is very important. Some people hire people to type if they write longhand. I could never do that, because that is the most important draft. It's the draft that I create my kind of really first draft that's typed. And then I can make sense of all these different perspectives. But it's about capturing lightning in a bottle. And I think you can do that when you take more chances and you're freer. You have a freer hand. And there's also a way that having a freer hand just enables you to work better, more quickly. You just say, I can write and I can get rid of this. I can, if I write a page and there are only 5 sentences on it that end up in the book, that's okay too. And sometimes those sentences are really important.
That makes me want to ask you another question about your process, because one of the things I love reading your book is how I was just so immersed in it. I'm not conscious of you there. I'm just in the book. I think some of the best writers definitely do that. So are you thinking of the reader as you write, or are you completely just trying to tell your story and not worrying about the audience?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I don't worry about the audience per se, but I do, I write pretty, I think I end up a kind of spare. I don't write, my books have never been more than 350 pages. I think this one has very big type. It's like, I don't know how long it is. This is my longest book, but I am very aware of moving the story along. I like propelling forward. And in a book like A Piece of the World that was about someone who basically never left her house, that was a real challenge. But the conflict and the drama was mostly internal in that book. And so I tried to create the same propellant for it that I have done with my other more action-packed stories like this one, which is on a ship across the ocean with all kinds of stuff happening. But I think in that way, I'm aware of the audience, just in that I want people to feel that they're moving along in the story and that things are kind of happening, and that they need to stay with it and pay attention.
Let me slip in another question. We're getting close to the end of our hour, but Paula emailed and asked, was Dr. Dunn based on a real person? Good question.
Yeah, I love that character of Dr. Dunn. In fact, the film women call him the hot doctor, like the hot.
Yeah, you kind of picture this guy that's like heroic.
Yeah. So I'm like imagining Paul Mescal playing him or something. He was so much fun to write because, why does an educated, erudite, very proper doctor in London end up on a convict ship, which is actually a very hard place to be? It has to be because of a scandal. So it was so much fun to read surgeons' logs and biographies of these men who ended up on convict ships and find out how they got there. And what happens in Dunn's case is that there's a scandal at his medical practice, and he really doesn't have an alternative, even though he's had this sort of first-class education and everything. And so he has to get out of the country, and that's what he does. And then what he discovers, which I love in the book, is his trajectory, which I won't give away too much, but he discovers that maybe Britain isn't the place he wants to be, and that life, that very stratified social life, is perhaps not what interests him anymore. So he's a composite, I suppose, but it was based on reading lots of surgeons' entries. Every surgeon on a ship had to have a log, which was sort of a journal, and they kept track of the women, but also of the weather and of their mood and things like that. And so I was fascinated by those, and I read quite a few of them.
Oh, so interesting. So I think we're running out of time to go too much further into the book. So I just want to ask you, what is next? You mentioned that you're working on your next book. Let's hear a little more about that.
Okay, let's see. What I can tell you is that I'm working on a book that's based on a family story from my own family about two sisters who, in Civil War era North Carolina, who married two brothers, two Asian brothers, and they had 21 children. And what I've just told you is the least interesting part of the story. So it's a really crazy family story. And the research for it is delightful and immersive, as I've told you. So I hope to have, I don't want to knock on wood. I hope to have a draft finished by the end of next year. I'm hoping it might come out in 2023 or early 24. So I'm not a book a year person. The research is too much, and all of it. So but I'm in it, and it's really fun.
And how long did it take you to write The Exiles?
The same. I think this will probably be about the same. It's sort of 2.5 years all together, research, writing. Once you hand in a book, and even when it's done, there's really a year till publication with these publishing houses. So I would say I'm 3 years between books from Piece of the World to this one. So it was, and you're working on your new book oftentimes when the other one's sort of in the pipeline. So I think it's about 2.5 years.
Well, can't wait for the next one. And congratulations on this phenomenal success with the Exiles. It's just a great, great read. So thank you so much for joining us, Christina Baker Kline, best-selling author, Mainer. And yeah, it's just a delight to talk to you. So thank you.
I've had a great time. You're an amazing interviewer. So thank you.
Oh, great. And thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight and listening in. I'm sure you learned a lot about the book and about Christina. And we hope you'll join us for the next book club, which is we're going to feature Landslide by Susan Conley. It is a great read as well. Jennifer Rooks will host that book club meeting. So that's in our August-September book club meeting. And thank you again to our two sponsors, Birch Brook and Bull Moose. And we hope you have a good evening. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.